A haunting image of a little girl clutching a doll in 1911 captivated generations with its innocent charm. Over a century later, when historians applied modern enhancement technology to examine the faded photograph, what they discovered left them completely stunned. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. In the suffocating darkness of the university archive, Professor Eleanor Wright rubbed her tired eyes as she shuffled through the brittle photographs. The clock on the wall showed well past midnight, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. The archive's ancient air conditioning hummed laboriously, doing little to dispel the musty scent of aged paper and forgotten memories. Just one more box, she whispered to herself, a promise she'd already broken 3 times tonight. Eleanor had spent 15 years at Salem University, but something about this particular collection of donated photographs felt different. She'd done this dozens of times before, but something about the pile tonight felt charged, like static before a storm. Her fingers, protected by thin cotton gloves, moved methodically through the images: family portraits, stoic farmers, stiff wedding parties, all the usual subjects from early 20th century America. The Blackwood collection had been gathering dust in storage for decades before the university acquired it last month. Most of it was unremarkable, exactly what one would expect from an affluent New England family. Then, a sepia-toned image caught her attention. Unlike the others, this photograph seemed to vibrate with life despite its age. Eleanor leaned closer, adjusting her reading glasses. A little girl, maybe 6 or 7, stood on the porch of a grand Victorian home, clutching a delicate porcelain doll. The house behind her loomed impressive and foreboding, with ornate gingerbread trim and tall, narrow windows that resembled watchful eyes. What made Eleanor's breath catch wasn't the house, but the child herself. Unlike every other stiff, unsmiling child from the era, this girl beamed, a smile that seemed to break through the century-old gloom. Her eyes sparkled with mischief, and her posture suggested she might burst into movement at any moment, defying the long exposure time needed for photographs in that period. The professor carefully turned the photograph over, searching for any notation. In faded, elegant script, someone had written, "Amelia, summer 1911. Eleanor felt a strange connection to the smiling child, as if Amelia were somehow present in the room, watching her discover this moment frozen in time. But it was the doll that made Eleanor pause. Nestled in Amelia's small arms was a porcelain figure with an eerily lifelike face. Even in the sepia tones, its eyes seemed to glisten with awareness. The doll's painted lips curved in a slight smile that mirrored its owner's, yet somehow felt less innocent. "What were you so happy about, Amelia?" Eleanor whispered, carefully placing the photograph on her scanning tray. "And what's the story behind your little friend?" Professor Eleanor Wright's heart raced as she read the faded caption on the back of the photograph: "Amelia Blackwood, Salem, 1911. The name struck a chord in her memory. She vaguely recalled stories of the Blackwoods during her doctoral research: old money, old secrets, and whispers of tragedy that had followed the family for generations. "Marcus, have you heard of the Blackwood family?" she called to her assistant, who was organizing documents at a nearby table. Marcus Chen looked up, adjusting his glasses. "The name sounds familiar. Weren't they prominent in Salem's textile industry?" Eleanor nodded, already pulling open the university's digital archives on her computer. "And they lived in that magnificent Victorian on Hawthorne Street, the one that burned down." As she scrolled through family records, Eleanor's pulse quickened. The Blackwoods had been Salem aristocracy, hosting lavish parties in their 3-story mansion until that dreadful night in 1911. A fire had started mysteriously in the East Wing, spreading with unnatural speed through the house while the family slept. "My God," she whispered, scanning the newspaper clippings. Both parents perished, Richard and Catherine Blackwood. They found them in their bedroom, overcome by smoke. She paused at a particularly grim description of the scene, deciding to spare Marcus the details. The professor continued piecing together the tragedy, her fingers trembling slightly as she turned brittle pages of archived reports. Little Amelia had somehow survived, found huddled in the garden, clutching her porcelain doll, refusing to speak to the police officers who discovered her. "The poor child," Eleanor murmured. "She was only 6 years old." What troubled her most was how abruptly the records ended. There were death certificates for the parents, insurance claims for the property, and brief mentions of Amelia being the sole survivor, but then nothing. No guardianship papers, no school records, no mention of what became of the orphaned girl or her haunting doll. "It's like she vanished," Eleanor said, more to herself than to Marcus. She stared again at the photograph, at Amelia's beaming face and those unsettling eyes of the doll. Something about this case felt different from her usual historical research, more personal, more urgent. "I need to know what happened to her," Eleanor decided, closing the file with determination. "And that doll, there's something about it that doesn't feel right." The university clock chimed 9, but Eleanor had no intention of leaving. The mystery of Amelia Blackwood and her porcelain companion had only just begun to unfold. Professor Eleanor Wright hunched closer to her computer monitor, the blue light casting an eerie glow across her face in the dimly lit archive. Her fingers moved deftly across the keyboard, zooming in on the high-resolution scan of Amelia Blackwood's photograph. The image had been digitized with remarkable clarity, revealing details invisible to the naked eye. "Let's see what you're hiding," she whispered to herself, focusing on the porcelain doll cradled in the little girl's arms. The doll wore an intricately detailed dress with lace trim, its blonde hair arranged in perfect ringlets. But as Eleanor magnified the image further, concentrating on the doll's face, an involuntary shiver ran down her spine. The eyes. Those eyes weren't just painted porcelain. They had depth, dimension, an unsettling glassiness that seemed to hold awareness. Most dolls from that era had flat, lifeless expressions, but this one seemed to be looking directly at her through the screen, across more than a century of time. Eleanor blinked hard and rubbed her eyes. It had to be a trick of light, or perhaps the exceptional quality of the photograph. Yet when she looked again, that same unnerving sensation returned. The distinct feeling of being watched by something that shouldn't be capable of watching. "This can't be right," she muttered, her mouth suddenly dry. The historian had examined thousands of historical artifacts throughout her career, but nothing had ever elicited such a visceral reaction. The doll's gaze seemed to follow her, its tiny lips curved in what could almost be interpreted as a knowing smile. Unable to trust her own perception, Eleanor pushed back from her desk. "Marcus!" she called out, her voice slightly higher than usual. "Could you come look at something?" Marcus Chen appeared from behind a row of filing cabinets, setting down the stack of documents he'd been organizing. The assistant moved quickly to her side, sensing the urgency in her tone. "What is it, Professor Wright?" he asked, leaning over her shoulder to view the screen. Eleanor pointed at the doll's face. "Tell me what you see in those eyes. Does anything strike you as unusual?" Marcus squinted, adjusting his glasses as he studied the image. The silence that followed was answer enough, but Eleanor needed to hear him say it. "Those eyes," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're too real. Almost like they're looking back at us," Eleanor finished, relieved she wasn't imagining things. Marcus Chen leaned in closer to the computer screen, squinting at the doll's eerie, glassy eyes. His dark brows furrowed as he adjusted his glasses, the blue light reflecting off his face in the dimly lit archive. "Maybe it's a European import," he suggested, tapping the screen thoughtfully. Some of those high-end dolls from Germany or France were almost too realistic. The craftsmanship back then was extraordinary. Still, his voice wavered slightly, betraying his unease. The research assistant shifted his weight from one foot to another, clearly disturbed by what he was seeing. Eleanor Wright shook her head slowly, her academic instincts warring with the primitive dread that had settled in her gut. "I've catalogued the Hargrove collection, Marcus. That had over 200 antique dolls from across Europe. None of them had eyes like this." She gestured at the screen, where the doll's gaze seemed to follow her movement. "Could it be a camera trick? Some kind of reflection?" Marcus offered, though his suggestion lacked conviction. He pulled up another historical photograph from the same era for comparison, showing a different child with a standard porcelain doll. The difference was striking. One was clearly an object. The other seemed almost sentient. Eleanor rubbed her temples, feeling the beginnings of a headache forming. In 15 years of historical research, she'd examined thousands of antique dolls in photographs, museums, and private collections. She'd documented their manufacturing techniques, the cultural significance, even the psychological impact on their owners, but none had ever seemed to stare back at her like this one. Isabel did. "Look at the positioning," she said, pointing to Amelia Blackwood's small hands clutching the doll. "See how protective her grip is, not like she's showing off a toy, but like she's restraining it." The young assistant nodded slowly, his earlier scientific skepticism fading. "The family records mentioned anything unusual about the doll?" "Nothing specific," Eleanor replied, scrolling through her notes. "Just that it was a cherished possession, and always at Amelia's side." She paused, remembering something. Though there was an odd note from a housekeeper who claimed she'd found it in different rooms, even when Amelia was away. Marcus stepped back from the screen, as if putting physical distance between himself and the image. "Maybe we should leave this one alone, Professor. Some historical mysteries are better left unsolved." Eleanor wanted to agree with him, but something in those painted yet somehow alive eyes had captured her. She couldn't look away now, even as every instinct warned her that she was staring into something ancient and dangerous. Eleanor Wright plunged deeper into the Blackwood family archives, her fingers carefully turning pages that hadn't seen light in decades. The university's collection contained boxes of documents that few researchers had bothered to examine thoroughly. As the night deepened outside the archive windows, she uncovered a detail that made her breath catch in her throat. "The sole survivor," the yellowed hospital record stated plainly. Amelia Blackwood had escaped the inferno that claimed her parents, but the trauma had exacted a terrible price. The child's mental state had shattered like fine crystal dropped on marble. The professor leaned closer, squinting at the faded handwriting of the attending physician. "Patient refuses all verbal communication with staff and family members." She read aloud to the empty room. "The child speaks only to her porcelain doll, which she has named Isabel. Attempts to separate them resulted in violent episodes and regression." Eleanor's hands trembled as she set the document aside. The sanatorium records painted a heartbreaking picture: a little girl, orphaned and traumatized, clinging to the one thing that survived the fire with her. But why had this particular doll become such a fixation? The answer came in a secondary entry. Tucked between financial records and property deeds, the Blackwood family had commissioned 2 identical dolls from a European craftsman, sisters, as they were described. While Isabel remained with Amelia, the second doll had been hastily hidden away by relatives after the fire. Following the incident, the document read, the remaining doll has been secured in the family vault. Several household staff reported unusual occurrences in its presence. The family does not wish to encourage superstition, but precautions have been deemed necessary. Eleanor scrolled through digital copies of personal letters between family members. They spoke in careful, veiled language about an unnatural force associated with the dolls when they were in proximity to each other. One aunt had written urgently to Dr. Franklin Bennett, pleading for his psychiatric assessment of whether the dolls might be contributing to Amelia's condition. Whatever these dolls were, Eleanor whispered to herself, they left nothing but heartbreak and fear in their wake. She pushed back from her desk, suddenly aware of how quiet the archive had become. The professor reached for her phone to text Marcus Chen. She needed another perspective on what she'd found. The historical record was clear. Everyone who had prolonged contact with either doll had experienced tragedy, paranoia, or both. The pattern was too consistent to ignore. The clock on the archive wall ticked past midnight as Professor Eleanor Wright rubbed her strained eyes. The blue light of her computer screen cast ghostly shadows across the room, illuminating dust particles that danced in the still air. She had been sifting through digitized documents for hours, determined to uncover more about the Blackwood tragedy. That's when she found it, a yellowed letter, carefully preserved and recently added to the digital archives. The handwriting belonged to Amelia Blackwood herself, penned in 1911, just weeks before the devastating fire. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she enlarged the scan, her heart quickening at the childish scrawl. "Isabel moves at night," the young girl had written, the letters uneven but determined. "She talks to me when everyone else is asleep. She tells me secrets about people, bad things that will happen." Eleanor sat back in her chair, a cold sensation washing over her. The historian had encountered many historical accounts of supposed hauntings and supernatural phenomena, but something about this simple declaration from a traumatized child felt different, more authentic, more chilling. "Professor Wright." Marcus Chen's voice startled her. Her assistant stood in the doorway, 2 cups of coffee in hand. "I thought you might need this." "Marcus, look at this," she said, gesturing him over. "It's Amelia's own account." The young man set down the beverages and leaned closer to the screen, his expression growing serious as he read the letter. "There's more," Eleanor continued, scrolling down. "She writes that Isabel warned her about the fire, but no one would listen. According to subsequent records Eleanor had uncovered, everyone who dismissed Amelia's claims about the doll had met with misfortune. Dr. Franklin Bennett, who had taken possession of the sister doll, developed severe insomnia before disappearing entirely in 1913. The housekeeper who had locked Isabel in a trunk was found dead 3 days later, her face frozen in an expression of terror. "The authorities ruled them all as coincidences," Eleanor murmured. "But there were too many to ignore." She pulled up another document, a newspaper clipping reporting that 3 separate families who had temporarily housed Amelia after the fire had experienced unexplained phenomena, voices at night, objects moving, and in one case, a small fire that started in the child's bedroom. "Do you think it's possible," Marcus asked, his scientific skepticism wavering, "that the doll was somehow—" Eleanor didn't answer immediately. The academic in her wanted to dismiss it all as superstition and coincidence, but the evidence formed a pattern too consistent to ignore. "I don't know what to believe," she finally admitted, "but something was happening in that house, and Isabel seems to be at the center of it all." Eleanor Wright's eyes burned from hours of reading Amelia's childish scrawl. She set the letter down and rubbed her temples, trying to process the implications of a child claiming her doll moved and spoke. The notification sound from her computer provided a welcome interruption. "University Archive, new materials available," the message read. Eleanor clicked it immediately, her fatigue forgotten. The digital catalogue showed a fresh collection of Blackwood family documents had been processed, photographs, letters, and newspaper clippings that had been sitting in storage for decades. One image in particular caught her attention, a grainy black-and-white photograph of the Blackwood Victorian home taken shortly after the devastating fire. The mansion's charred skeleton stood against a grey sky, windows like hollow eyes in its blackened face. But something wasn't right about the upper floor. "That can't be," Eleanor whispered, leaning closer to her screen. In one of the second-floor windows, barely visible through the soot-stained glass, sat a small figure. The historian's fingers trembled as she used the archive's digital tools to enhance the image. With each increase in magnification, her heart beat faster. The pixelation cleared enough to reveal what appeared to be Isabel, the porcelain doll, perched in the windowsill, facing outward. "This is impossible," she muttered, adjusting her glasses. The report said everything in that room was destroyed. Yet there it was. The doll's painted face seemed to stare directly at the photographer, its delicate features arranged in what Eleanor could only describe as awareness. Not the blank expression of a toy, but something calculating and present. She checked the photograph's metadata. It had been taken 3 days after the fire, when the house should have been empty of survivors and salvageable possessions. According to all accounts, Amelia had been taken to the hospital immediately. Her doll nowhere to be found in the wreckage. Eleanor downloaded the image and sent it to the department's advanced imaging lab with an urgent request for further enhancement. She needed to be certain before sharing this with anyone else, even Marcus Chen. The young assistant was already jumpy enough about the whole project. She glanced at the clock, nearly midnight. The university hallways would be empty now, the perfect time to visit the physical archives without interruption. If the doll had somehow survived the fire, perhaps there were other inconsistencies in the official account. Eleanor saved her work and gathered her notes. As she closed the digital file, she couldn't shake the feeling that Isabel's porcelain eyes had followed her movement across the screen, an impossible thought that nonetheless sent a chill through her body as she prepared to delve deeper into the Blackwood mystery. That night, Eleanor Wright tossed and turned in her bed, the image of Amelia's doll haunting her even as she drifted into uneasy sleep. Soon, she found herself standing before the grand Victorian home of the Blackwoods, its imposing structure somehow both intact and decaying simultaneously. The front door creaked open at her touch, inviting her into a world suspended between past and present. Eleanor wandered through the hallways, her fingers trailing along wallpaper that peeled away like autumn leaves. The air hung thick with smoke, not the choking kind from a raging fire, but something more insidious, like memories burning away at the edges. "Hello?" she called, her voice swallowed by the vastness of the house. No answer came, yet she wasn't alone. Somewhere upstairs, the light sound of a child's laughter echoed through the corridors, innocent at first, then shifting into something that made the professor's skin crawl. Following the sound, Eleanor climbed the grand staircase, each step groaning beneath her weight. Photographs lined the walls, faces she couldn't quite make out, except for Amelia's, which seemed to follow her movement with those same bright eyes from the archive photo. The laughter led her to a bedroom at the end of the hall. The door stood slightly ajar, a sliver of moonlight spilling onto the worn carpet. Inside, a child-sized bed with rumpled sheets sat empty, but on a chair by the window, Isabel waited. The porcelain doll sat perfectly poised, hands folded in her lap, wearing the same dress Eleanor had seen in the photograph. For a moment, everything was still. Then, impossibly, the doll's head began to turn, not with the jerky movement of a toy, but with the deliberate motion of something alive. Eleanor tried to back away, but her feet wouldn't move. She watched, paralyzed, as Isabel's head rotated fully toward her. The doll's glass eyes, once vacant, now seemed to hold centuries of awareness. They locked onto Eleanor's with such intensity that she felt exposed, as if the creature could see every fear, every secret she'd ever harbored. The doll's painted lips parted slightly, and Eleanor heard a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "You found us. Now we found you." Eleanor woke with a violent start, her nightgown soaked with sweat, heart hammering against her ribs. She fumbled for the bedside lamp, desperate to chase away the darkness. The historian sat upright, gasping for air. The image of those knowing eyes burned into her memory like a brand. She reached for her phone, checking the time. 3 in the morning. Too early to call Marcus, too late to go back to sleep. The dream felt more like a visitation than a nightmare, and Eleanor couldn't shake the certainty that something had changed tonight. Something had noticed her. Eleanor Wright spent the next 3 days buried in the Salem Historical Society's newspaper archives. The musty smell of aging paper filled her nostrils as she carefully turned brittle pages from 1911, searching for any mention of the Blackwood family tragedy. On the 4th day, her persistence paid off. Tucked between advertisements for ladies, corsets and Model T automobiles was a small article that made her heart race. "Child claims, doll speaks warnings," read the headline. The piece detailed how young Amelia Blackwood had become increasingly agitated in the weeks before the fire, insisting to household staff that her porcelain companion, Isabel, whispered to her at night. "The child maintains that the doll predicted calamity," the article stated. "Household staff report the young miss refused to be separated from the toy, claiming it warned of bad things coming to the family home." The professor's fingers trembled as she photographed the article with her device. Most disturbing was the quote from the Blackwood family cook, who claimed to have once found the doll in the kitchen when she was certain it had been upstairs with Amelia moments before. A follow-up piece published 2 weeks after the devastating fire mentioned the strange disappearance of the doll. Despite the thorough investigation by local authorities, Isabel was never recovered from the ruins. The police report noted this as unexplained but inconsequential compared to the tragic deaths of Amelia's parents. "They didn't even try," Eleanor whispered to herself, scanning the dismissive tone of the officials quoted. The investigation had been cursory at best, focusing on practical matters like faulty wiring and discarded cigarettes. She wondered if the authorities had been genuinely uninterested in a missing toy during such tragedy, or if something more troubling had occurred, if perhaps they had deliberately avoided pursuing that particular mystery. Had anyone actually wanted to find that doll? Eleanor made notes in her journal, connecting the newspaper accounts with the hospital records she'd found earlier. The sanitarium staff had documented Amelia's repeated insistence that Isabel had gone to find her sister and would come back when it was time. As the historian packed away her research materials, a chill crept up her spine. The sensation of being watched returned, stronger than before. She glanced around the empty archive room, seeing nothing unusual, yet unable to shake the feeling that something or someone was monitoring her progress with great interest. Perhaps, she thought as she hurried toward the exit, those who had encountered Isabel before had felt this same unease and had chosen the comfort of ignorance over the terror of truth. Eleanor's computer chimed with a new email notification. She glanced at the screen, expecting another academic inquiry, but found no subject line, just an attachment. Clicking it open, Professor Wright felt her blood turn to ice. The image showed 2 porcelain dolls sitting side by side in an elegant glass display case. She recognized Isabel immediately, her painted lips curved in that unsettling half-smile. Beside her sat the sister doll, nearly identical except for a blue ribbon where Isabel's was red. "Marcus!" she called, her voice cracking. "Come look at this!" Her assistant hurried over, coffee in hand. His eyes widened as he took in the image. "Aren't those supposed to be in deep storage?" "In the climate-controlled vault," Eleanor nodded, her fingers trembling slightly as she zoomed in on the background details. "This is the Hendricks Gallery, on the other side of campus. I never authorized any transfer or exhibit." She quickly pulled up the archive's digital catalogue. According to the records, both dolls had been catalogued, photographed, and secured in the university's Special Collections vault over 20 years ago. Neither had been checked out or moved since their initial archiving. "This has to be some kind of prank," Marcus suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe someone on the maintenance staff found them and thought they belonged in the gallery." Eleanor shook her head. "The vault requires 2 separate security clearances. And look at the timestamp on this email, 3:15 this morning. The building's locked after 10. She grabbed her phone and called campus security, demanding to know if anyone had accessed the archive overnight. The answer only deepened the mystery. No unauthorized entries, no alarms triggered, nothing on the security cameras. "We need to go there. Now." Eleanor grabbed her jacket and keys. The drive across campus took only minutes, but each second stretched painfully. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her through the windshield of her car, something with glass eyes that never blinked. When they arrived at the Hendricks Gallery, the curator appeared confused by their urgency. "We don't have any doll exhibit," she insisted, leading them through the quiet halls. But there it was, exactly as in the photograph, a standalone display case near the back wall, illuminated by a single spotlight. Isabel and her sister sat primly inside, their porcelain hands nearly touching. Eleanor approached slowly, feeling a strange pressure building in her ears. Who authorized this?" she whispered. The curator checked her records, frowning deeply. "There's nothing here. No delivery notice, no exhibit proposal. It's as if they just appeared." As Eleanor leaned closer to the glass, Isabel's head seemed to tilt ever so slightly toward her. The historian jumped back, her heart hammering against her ribs. "They want to be seen," she murmured. "After all this time, they want to be found." Eleanor Wright and Marcus Chen raced across the university campus, their footsteps echoing through the marble hallways of the East Wing. They found the exhibit in a dimly lit corner of the anthropology department, a modest display case containing a single porcelain doll with glassy eyes that seemed to follow their movements. "Where's the other one?" Eleanor whispered, pressing her palm against the glass. According to the records, both dolls should have been stored together in the archive's temperature-controlled vault. Marcus checked the small information card beside the display. "It says here that Isabel's companion was donated to a private collection 15 years ago." He squinted at the faded text. "By a Dr. Franklin Bennett." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Bennett was Amelia Blackwood's psychiatrist at the sanatorium. She'd read his name in passing, but hadn't realized his connection extended beyond treatment notes. Back in the archive, they dug through Bennett's personal records, journals the university had acquired after his death in the 1970s. The leather-bound notebooks revealed a troubling progression. What began as clinical observations of young Amelia evolved into something far more disturbing. "I have acquired the second doll," Bennett wrote in an entry dated October 12, 1912. "The board believes separating the dolls might help Amelia's recovery, but I find myself drawn to its craftsmanship. The artistry is remarkable, almost too lifelike." Eleanor turned the brittle pages carefully, noting how Bennett's handwriting deteriorated over subsequent entries, becoming jagged and frantic. "3 nights without sleep," read an entry from December. I hear my name whispered when no one is present. Franklin, it calls. Franklin, look at me. The psychiatrist documented placing the doll in a locked cabinet, only to find it sitting on his desk chair the following morning. I know I secured it, he wrote. Yet it moves. I feel its gaze upon me even now as I write these words. Marcus shivered as Eleanor read aloud the final entry. I cannot bear it any longer. The doll watches me, waits for me. I must donate it somewhere far away. Perhaps then I will find peace. He never did, Eleanor murmured, closing the journal. Bennett died of a heart attack 3 months after donating the doll. The medical examiner noted extreme sleep deprivation as a contributing factor. She glanced at Marcus, whose face had gone pale. We need to contact whoever has that doll now. And say what? He asked. Oh, that we think it's haunted? Eleanor stared at the photograph of Isabel, still displayed on her computer screen. We tell them they're in danger. These dolls were never meant to be separated, and they'll do whatever it takes to be reunited. Eleanor Wright and Marcus Chen spent the morning making calls to track down the second doll. After several frustrating hours, they finally reached Richard Holloway, curator of the Bennett Collection, a private assortment of historical artifacts once owned by Dr. Franklin Bennett himself. Yes, we have the doll, Holloway confirmed over the phone, his voice uncharacteristically tight for a man who typically welcomed academic inquiries. But I'm afraid viewing it is impossible at the moment. We're conducting important research about the Blackwood family, Eleanor pressed, exchanging a concerned glance with her assistant. There have been disturbances, the curator replied after a lengthy pause. Items moving overnight. Security cameras malfunctioning specifically in the doll's display room. His voice dropped to nearly a whisper. 3 staff members have resigned in the past month. Marcus leaned closer to hear through the speakerphone. Has anyone reported hearing voices or laughter? The silence that followed was answer enough. When Holloway spoke again, his words came out rushed. I strongly advise you to abandon this research, Professor Wright. Some artifacts are better left undisturbed. The line went dead before Eleanor could respond. He's terrified, Marcus observed, running a hand through his hair. Whatever's happening there matches the patterns in Dr. Bennett's notes. Eleanor nodded grimly. The dolls want to be reunited, and they're making their presence known. That evening, Eleanor stayed late at the archive, organizing her findings and preparing notes for a meeting with the university board. The building had emptied hours ago, leaving only the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional creak of the old structure settling. When she finally gathered her belongings to leave, something on her desk caught her eye, a photograph that hadn't been there before. Her blood ran cold as she picked it up with trembling fingers. The image showed Isabel, the porcelain doll, photographed against a black background. Unlike the historical photographs, this one was in perfect color, revealing the doll's pale complexion and rosy cheeks in disturbing detail. But it was the eyes that made Eleanor's heart hammer against her ribs, glass eyes fixed directly on the camera with an unnatural awareness. The doll's painted lips were parted in what could only be described as a mocking half-smile. Eleanor dropped the photograph as if it had burned her. She scanned the empty room, suddenly aware of how alone she was in the vast archive. There was no note, no explanation for how the image had appeared. Someone, or something, wanted her to know they were watching. The campus mail arrived at Eleanor Wright's office just after lunch. Among the usual academic journals and departmental memos sat a cream-colored envelope that immediately caught her attention. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind no one used anymore, and bore a postmark that made her breath catch. Salem, 1911. This is impossible, Eleanor whispered, carefully turning the envelope in her trembling hands. The paper showed no yellowing, No brittleness that would betray its supposed age. It looked as though it had been mailed yesterday, yet the postmark was unmistakable. With surgical precision, she sliced open the envelope using her letter opener. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. Covered in the uneven handwriting of a child, the historian's professional instincts screamed that this was either an elaborate hoax or a supernatural impossibility. "They'll always be together," read Amelia's childish scrawl. "If you see one, the other is never far." Eleanor's mouth went dry. She reached for her water bottle but knocked it over instead, sending water cascading across her desk. She barely noticed. The professor's eyes remained fixed on the letter. Reading the words over and over until they burned into her mind, she called Marcus Chen immediately. "I need you in my office. Now." When her assistant arrived, breathless from rushing across campus, Eleanor handed him the letter without a word. Marcus examined it carefully, his academic training momentarily overriding his growing unease about the Blackwood case. "This paper," he began, running his finger along the edge. "It's modern, high quality, but definitely not from 1911. But the handwriting matches Amelia's hospital records perfectly," Eleanor countered, pulling up the digital scans on her computer. "Look at the way she forms her G's and Y's. It's identical." Marcus set the letter down as if it might burn him. "What does this mean about the dolls?" Eleanor stared at the words again, the truth crystallizing in her mind with terrifying clarity. "It means their connection isn't just sentimental, it's something deeper, unbreakable." She looked up at her assistant, fear etching lines around her eyes. "And dangerous." "But how could Amelia know we'd be investigating this now? She'd be over 100 years old if she were still alive." Eleanor shook her head, remembering Dr. Bennett's notes about his growing obsession with the doll. "I don't think Amelia sent this," she whispered. "Oh, I think Isabel did." The university building creaked around them as if responding to her words, and both researchers fell silent, suddenly aware of the weight of what they'd uncovered, a connection between two porcelain figures that defied time, space, and reason. Marcus Chen paced nervously between the towering shelves of the university archive, his usually steady hands fidgeting with his smartphone. Eleanor Wright noticed his distraction as she catalogued the Blackwood materials, but chose to focus on her work instead. "I saw her again last night," Marcus finally blurted out, his voice barely above a whisper. "A little girl, just like Amelia in that photograph. She was standing between the microfiche cabinets, watching me." Eleanor sighed, setting down her pencil. "Marcus, we've been working 16-hour days. Your mind is playing tricks on you." "This wasn't imagination," the assistant insisted, leaning closer. "And she wore the same dress as in the photo, but her face, it was wrong somehow, and she was holding that doll, Isabel." "You're letting this research get to you," Eleanor replied, though her confident tone masked her own growing unease. She'd chosen not to tell Marcus about the cold spots she'd encountered in her office, or how her computer had repeatedly opened the scanned image of Isabel without any input. "I'm thinking of stepping away from this project," Marcus admitted, his usual academic composure crumbling. "Last night, I found a porcelain hand on my desk. Just the hand, Eleanor. When I looked again, it was gone." The professor wanted to dismiss his fears, but something in his eyes, raw terror, gave her pause. She reached across the table and squeezed his arm reassuringly. "Take the weekend off. Clear your head." After Marcus left, Eleanor worked late into the night, the archive building emptying until only the security guard remained on his rounds. Around midnight, as she was examining Dr. Bennett's psychiatric notes, she heard it, the soft patter of small footsteps in the corridor outside. She froze, pen hovering above her notepad. The footsteps stopped, then continued, lighter than an adult's tread. "Hello?" Eleanor called, rising from her chair. No response came. She moved toward the door, the old floorboards creaking beneath her weight. As she reached for the handle, a sudden chill enveloped the room, dropping the temperature so rapidly her breath clouded before her face. The unmistakable sound of a child's laughter, high and sweet, yet somehow hollow, echoed through the stacks. Eleanor's hand trembled as she pulled the door open, revealing an empty hallway, but the air carried the distinct scent of smoke, not cigarettes or electrical burning, but the rich, woody smell of a house fire. The same smell that must have filled the Blackwood home that fateful night in 1911. Eleanor backed into her office, heart pounding. The laughter came again, closer now, followed by the soft click of porcelain against wood. Eleanor Wright spent 3 sleepless nights poring over genealogical records. The haunting connection to the Blackwood family gnawed at her, driving her to dig deeper than any academic curiosity ever had. Something about this case felt intensely personal, as though invisible threads were pulling her toward an inevitable revelation. "There has to be a reason I found that photograph," she whispered to herself, fingers trembling as she scrolled through digitized census records from the early 1900s. The professor had always known fragments of her family history, her father's side, traced back to Massachusetts, but the details had grown fuzzy through generations of migration and remarriage. Now, hunched over her computer at 3 in the morning, the pieces suddenly aligned with terrifying clarity. "Eleanor Simmons," she gasped, staring at the yellowed marriage certificate on her screen. Her great-great-aunt, the woman she'd been named after, had been born a Simmons before marrying into the Wright family, and there, in the family tree documentation, was the undeniable connection. Eleanor Simmons had been first cousins with Amelia Blackwood's mother. The historian sat back, a cold wave washing over her. This wasn't random academic research anymore. The dolls, the haunting, the mysterious photographs, they were reaching out to family. When Marcus arrived the next morning, he found her surrounded by printouts and family photographs she'd retrieved from storage. "You look terrible," he said, setting down 2 coffee cups. "Did you sleep at all?" "I'm related to her, Marcus," Eleanor said, her voice hollow, "to Amelia. My great-great-aunt was her cousin. I was named after her." The assistant's expression shifted from concern to unease. "That can't be coincidence." "No," she agreed. "The dolls found me, or I found them. Either way, we're connected." Eleanor pulled out an old family album she hadn't opened in years. Inside was a faded photograph of her namesake, a stern-faced woman in her 30s, standing beside a rose bush. The resemblance between them was subtle but unmistakable. "And the Blackwood fire happened 2 months after this photo was taken," she explained. "According to these letters, my great-great-aunt was supposed to visit that weekend, but cancelled last minute due to illness." Marcus leaned closer. "She survived by chance. And now, a century later, I'm the one who found Amelia's photograph." Eleanor closed the album with shaking hands. "This isn't just academic anymore. Whatever started in 1911 isn't finished. And somehow, I'm meant to resolve it." The weight of this revelation settled over the room like a shroud. The past wasn't just reaching out, it was claiming her as its own. Eleanor Wright's heart was in her throat as she pushed open the heavy archive door. After the revelations about her ancestral connection to the Blackwoods, she'd spent the night tossing and turning, haunted by dreams of Amelia's smile and Isabel's glassy stare. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as she made her way to her desk. Something was different. An unmarked manila envelope sat centered on her blotter, though she was certain she'd left her workspace immaculate the evening before. "Marcus!" she called out, but the archive remained silent. The professor's fingers trembled as she reached for the envelope. It was unsealed, as if whoever had left it wanted her to find its contents immediately. Inside was a single photograph, not aged or sepia-toned like the historical documents she'd been studying, but crisp and new. The image made her blood run cold. Both dolls, Isabel and her sister, were positioned together on what appeared to be a velvet cushion. Their porcelain hands were clasped tightly, their painted faces pressed close as if sharing whispered secrets between them. "This isn't possible," Eleanor murmured, her academic mind struggling against what her eyes were seeing. The dolls had been separated for decades, one in university storage, the other in Dr. Bennett's private collection. She flipped the photograph over, searching for any clue, any explanation. The back was blank, except for a single word written in childish script. "Together." Eleanor sank into her chair, the photograph still clutched in her shaking hands. The curator had refused to release the second doll. Yet here was evidence that somehow, impossibly, the pair had been reunited. A memory surfaced, Amelia's letter from 1911. "They'll always be together. If you see one, the other is never far." The historian felt a chill sweep through the archive, rustling papers and raising goosebumps on her arms. The cycle was complete. Whatever force bound these dolls, whatever had driven Dr. Bennett to obsession and Amelia to silence, was awake again. She reached for her phone to call Marcus, but hesitated. The young assistant was already spooked enough. Eleanor stared again at the photograph, at the dolls' faces, their expressions no longer blank and innocent, but knowing, triumphant even. "What do you want?" she whispered to the image. Only silence answered her, but Eleanor understood with bone-deep certainty that the reunion of these porcelain figures had set something in motion, something that had been waiting patiently for over a century. Something that had specifically chosen her as its witness. The shrill wail of the security alarm pierced the night, sending Professor Eleanor Wright bolting upright in bed. Her phone buzzed frantically, campus security, heart hammering against her ribs. She fumbled for her car keys, dialing Marcus Chen with trembling fingers. "I heard it too," he answered before she could speak. "Ndi, meet you there in 10 minutes. The university grounds were eerily silent, except for the pulsing red lights of security vehicles. Eleanor's footsteps echoed across the marble floor as she raced toward the archive, where 2 guards stood with flashlights, their faces ashen. "Professor Wright," one nodded grimly, "you'll want to see this." The exhibition room was in chaos. Glass shards glittered like diamonds across the polished floor. Reflecting the emergency lights in fractured patterns, Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she approached the shattered display case, where Isabel and her sister doll had been positioned just hours earlier. There was nothing but empty velvet. "The cameras," she whispered. The security guard shook his head. "Static. All of them. Then complete blackout for exactly 7 minutes." Marcus arrived, breathless, his normally composed demeanor crumbling as he surveyed the scene. "They're gone," he stated unnecessarily, his voice hollow. Eleanor knelt beside the case, careful to avoid the glass. That's when she noticed it, a small, blackened imprint on the floor. A handprint, too small for an adult, with fingers splayed as if pressed in haste. The scorched mark seemed to have burned directly into the hardwood, leaving behind the acrid smell of smoke. "Did you hear that?" Marcus suddenly tensed, turning toward the darkened hallway. A soft, melodic giggle floated through the air, childlike, innocent, yet somehow deeply wrong in its playfulness. Eleanor felt the hairs on her neck rise as the sound echoed once, twice, then faded into silence. "Amelia?" she whispered, though she knew it couldn't be possible. The security team searched every corner of the building, but found nothing. No footprints, no signs of forced entry beyond the shattered case, and no explanation for how two antique dolls could simply vanish. As dawn broke, casting long shadows through the archive windows, the giggling had stopped. The only evidence anything had happened was the broken glass, the scorched handprint, and the lingering scent of smoke that reminded Eleanor of the Blackwood house fire. "They're together now," she murmured to Marcus as they watched the sunrise, exhaustion etched into their faces. Whatever happens next? She couldn't finish the thought. The historian in her wanted answers. But the primal part of her soul knew some mysteries were better left unsolved. The university buzzed with whispers in the wake of the dolls. Disappearance. Professor Eleanor Wright overheard fragments of theories as she walked through the hallways. Some students claimed it was a fraternity prank gone wrong, while faculty members debated whether valuable artifacts should have been displayed so openly. In the cafeteria, a group of psychology majors discussed the possibility of a curse attached to the Blackwood family heirlooms. "Security footage shows nothing," the head of campus safety announced at the emergency meeting. "Just static, then the case is empty." His explanation did little to quell the rising anxiety among the staff. Eleanor sat silently, her fingers tracing the edge of her notebook. She knew what they didn't, that no ordinary thief had taken those dolls. The scorched handprint couldn't be explained away by vandalism, nor could the childish laughter Marcus had recorded on his phone. That afternoon, Dean Harrington approached her desk. "Eleanor, the board is concerned about the negative publicity. Perhaps we should focus on other projects for now." She nodded mechanically, relieved to have an excuse to step away. The truth was, Eleanor had already begun removing herself from the investigation. Each night brought new terrors, visions of the Blackwood house engulfed in flames, porcelain hands reaching through the fire, and Isabel's painted eyes somehow blinking in the darkness. Her colleagues noticed the change. The once dedicated professor now jumped at shadows and kept her office door open at all times. She'd installed extra lights in her home and slept with music playing to drown out any whispers that might come in the night. "You need to talk to someone," suggested Dr. Patel from the psychology department when she found Eleanor staring blankly at the archive wall. "This obsession isn't healthy." But how could Eleanor explain that she felt Amelia's presence everywhere, that sometimes, from the corner of her eye, she caught glimpses of a little girl in outdated clothes, standing just beyond doorways, or that her bathroom mirror occasionally reflected not just her face, but Isabel's delicate features superimposed over her own? She withdrew from social events, stopped attending faculty meetings, and requested a reduced teaching load. Her apartment walls became covered with timelines and photographs, not for research now, but in a desperate attempt to make sense of what was happening. One night, Eleanor woke to find her computer on, displaying an old photograph of the Blackwood family. Though she was certain she'd shut everything down before bed, the screen glowed in the darkness. Isabel's face circled in red. Eleanor knew then that the dolls weren't just haunting the university. They had chosen her, and they weren't finished yet. The doorbell rang just after 9 in the evening. Eleanor Wright wasn't expecting visitors, especially not after weeks of self-imposed isolation. Through the peephole, she saw Marcus Chen shifting nervously on her doorstep, his usually composed demeanor replaced by something she'd never seen before. Raw terror. "Do you look terrible?" she said, ushering him inside. The young assistant's face was ashen, dark circles framing his bloodshot eyes. He hadn't slept, that much was clear. "I can't stay in my apartment anymore," Marcus whispered, collapsing onto her couch. His hands trembled as he accepted the cup of tea she offered. "They found me, Eleanor." A chill ran through her body. She didn't need to ask who they were. "Last night," he continued, voice breaking, I woke up around 3 in the morning. You know that feeling when you're being watched? He paused, swallowing hard. They were standing at the foot of my bed, both of them, Isabel and her sister, their porcelain hands linked together. Eleanor felt her mouth go dry. Maybe it was just a nightmare. No. Marcus cut her off with unexpected firmness. Their eyes, Eleanor, they weren't painted anymore. They were alive, glistening. Following me when I moved. He clutched his cup tighter. And they were smiling, not like in the photograph. Different, like they knew something I didn't. The research assistant described how he'd frozen in terror, unable to scream or move as the dolls slowly approached his bed. They whispered something. It sounded like, "You've seen too much." Eleanor sank into the chair across from him, her academic skepticism crumbling under the weight of everything they'd uncovered. The Blackwood tragedy, Amelia's warnings, Dr. Bennett's descent into obsession, it all formed a pattern she could no longer deny. "We've become part of their story now," she said quietly, remembering her genealogical discovery. The connection to her great-great-aunt Eleanor Simmons wasn't coincidence, it was invitation. These aren't just historical artifacts we're studying, they're studying us too. Marcus nodded, a tear escaping down his cheek. "What do we do?" Eleanor gazed out her window at the darkening sky, feeling the invisible threads of the past wrapping around her present. The dolls had transcended time, bringing their century-old malevolence into her world. They weren't content to remain in dusty archives or glass cases. "I don't think we can escape them," she admitted, the realization settling like ice in her stomach. "They've chosen us for something. And I'm afraid we're going to find out what." Eleanor Wright packed her belongings in the dead of night, leaving behind her position at the university and the life she had built. Salem held too many shadows now, too many whispers that followed her through the archives and into her dreams. She changed her name to Catherine Mills and moved 3,000 miles away to a small coastal town where no one knew her past. But distance provided no sanctuary. The nightmares pursued her relentlessly. Each night, as she drifted into uneasy sleep, the familiar sounds would begin. The soft click of porcelain joints moving in the darkness, the rustle of tiny silk dresses against hardwood floors, and the unmistakable laughter of a little girl, high and sweet but undercut with something ancient and knowing. "They always find those who know their secret," Marcus had warned in their final phone call before she disappeared. The professor hadn't heard from her former assistant since that conversation. Sometimes she wondered if he too had fled, or if the dolls had found him first. She tried to rebuild her life, taking a position at a local community college, teaching basic history courses, nothing that would lead her back to those photographs or the Blackwood family tragedy. Yet she found herself unconsciously scanning her students' faces, looking for Amelia's features or the glassy stare of Isabel. One morning, Catherine discovered a child's drawing slipped under her apartment door. A crude sketch of two dolls holding hands, standing before a house engulfed in flames. There was no signature, no explanation, just a small handprint in what looked like ash at the bottom corner. That night, she dreamed of Dr. Bennett standing in her bedroom, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. "They were never meant to be separated," he whispered. "Now they're together again. And they remember who helped reunite them." Catherine woke to find her research journals, the ones she'd sworn she'd destroyed, arranged in a perfect circle on her living room floor. In the center lay a single porcelain finger, impossibly small and delicate. She understood then what she had always known. There would be no escape. The dolls had been reunited, their century-old secret still buried in the ashes of the Blackwood house. But their watchful gaze would follow anyone who had dared to look too deeply into the past, especially those with Blackwood blood flowing through their veins. As dawn broke, Catherine heard the soft patter of small footsteps approaching her bedroom door, followed by two shadows stretching across the floor, one tall and thin, one small and childlike.